If you need your funny bone tickled and your skin to crawl a bit, you might want to check out The Parenting. It's a new horror comedy on Max, and it has a decent cast. Young couple Rohan and Josh plan a perfect weekend getaway in the country to introduce their parents, but as tensions begin to flare between the more traditional Sharon and Frank and the laid-back Liddy and Cliff, the families soon realize that their rental, managed by an eccentric local, is haunted by the presence of a 400-year-old poltergeist. The cast is fairly small for this. We've got Nik Dodani, Brandon Flynn, Brian Cox, Edie Falco, Lisa Kudrow, Dean Norris, Vivian Bang, and Parker Posey. Now, Dodani and Flynn have invited each of their parents to this large rental house so that everybody can get to know each other. But once arriving, an otherworldly voice calls out to one of them in the attempt to possess and then rule. Now, when the film started, I thought the scene was like a commercial being shot or some kishy TV program that was being produced. And it takes place in the early 80s, and it is nostalgically cheesy. No, though, this is just the setup for the rest of the story, which then takes place in the present day. Now, even after that odd and quirky start, the story still took about 15 minutes before I even began to become somewhat engaged. Once the parents arrive, that's when dialogue began to get awkwardly funny and the groove of the story started to gel. Now, Brian Cox and Edie Falco are one set of parents, Sharon and Frank, and they're the more sophisticated, rich, even snobby couple. And both of them chew up their roles, delivering their lines with dry and stoic wit. I didn't really care about Rohan and Josh, the two who invited the parents, but I could really get behind Sharon and Frank, even though they didn't come across as emotionally connected parents or even nice people. And then we get Lisa Kudrow and Dean Norris playing Liddy and Cliff. They're polar opposites to the other couple. Liddy and Cliff are both open with their feelings and demonstrative when it comes to their son, but they're also just ordinary people, little rough around the edges and socially awkward, but genuinely sweet and caring. And just like with Falco and Cox, Kudrow and Norris are hilarious with nervous and uncomfortable line deliveries. Now, a lot of the strained interactions between the young men and their parents, they're forced, and they feel unnatural, just trying to create laughs or silly situations rather than having naturally occurring scenes with less needy attempts. After a bit, though, the humor does land more consistently, usually set up and executed by one of the more seasoned actors. Now, probably the biggest surprise for me in this was Brian Cox. Now, I know he can be funny, but here, he's almost thrown caution to the wind and embraced a different level of vulnerability. He has some challenging storylines to fulfill, and he grabs hold with abandon. Now, for the horror aspects of this, there are more than a couple of times when the imagery was subtle and wrong. You know when there's something unmoving in the shadows somewhere in the background, or when a character does a move that is just wildly unnatural? There are more than a couple of sequences that are just going to give you the willies. And if you're squeamish, now beware. A couple of times there are some spectacularly gross scenes that might make you irp just a little bit. One of them I actually rewound to watch again because of the length of time the effect went on. It went from nasty to absurdly nasty, and I laughed while I gagged. And when it comes to seeing anything supernatural, when the effects were practical, they looked great. Whether that be some scraggly hand with long nails, or just simply makeup to make a character look a bit like Reagan in The Exorcist. But when CGI was employed, it was very obvious that it was fake, and it didn't enhance the tension. It just looked silly. I'd mentioned how I wasn't totally enamored with Rohan and Josh, but to the film's credit, in the final act, I began to root for them more, and they became more endearing. This does have a sweet family theme that's intermixed within the dysfunctional family antics and the demonic terror. Now, the growth we get to see between the characters, I thought was charming, creating a bond between them that makes them more likable as a group, but also makes their comedy even stronger. Lisa Kudrow is extremely funny, and she commits to her bit. I think she's channeling a tiny bit of Phoebe Buffay to create Liddy, but it totally works. She's self-aware, which makes her deliveries even funnier and enjoyable, calling out the obvious and then using it as the punchline. Now, Parker Posey doesn't have a large role, but for what she's got, she is the perfect choice to be the odd caretaker for the rental home. She's kind of like a goth hippie, and thanks to all of Posey's improv work, she makes her character as strange and socially inept as possible. We're not meant to like her or really hate her, but she certainly creates some sort of emotion, though, through her presence. Now, I like that this comes in at 100 minutes. It's not too long, and it gets into the crux of the plot efficiently. It doesn't outstay its welcome, and there's not much fluff that weighs the storytelling down. Almost everything helps to advance the plot and build the world that the characters are trying to survive. And while we don't get a ton of background development on the characters up front, enough comes through the course of conversations to let us be familiar with the players. And for this story, while we need to feel some connection for them just in order to be concerned for their outcomes, most of the fun comes from watching the strained interactions and the humor that then stems from that. So overall, the parenting takes a bit to get going, but once the actors all come together, laughs come easily thanks to witty and expertly delivered comedy. Cox, Falco, Kudrow, and Norris steal every scene, using self-awareness and dry humor to build charmingly dysfunctional conversations. While the digital effects aren't great, the makeup and practical effects are wonderful, building out gag-inducing imagery and some skin-crawling chills. This is great for a casual watch. It should put a smile on your face, maybe even a bit of bile in your mouth. There's no sex, some nudity, ton of profanity, and some violence. I give the parenting 3.5 out of 5 couches. Have you seen any good horror comedies lately? I would love to hear about them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.